Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cloud Cuts. So, this is the show where we cut through the noise in cloud backup and data protection, and we help security teams understand how they can get more out of their data protection strategy. Today, we're actually going to be talking, about a really important part of data protection, which is recovery, and about how now with the rise of AI, what's really become critical is the concept of incident response and how we're actually going to be able to respond to cyber incidents, attacks, bad actors, when the pace and really the types of attacks are just increasing all the time, and we have a lot more being thrown at us and that we have to deal with. So we have two really I would say impressive experts in this space that are dealing with us that are joining us today. We have John Raper. As well as Steve Stone. So we're going to do some quick introductions and then we're actually going to jump into it. Today we're going to be focusing on three important topics. So one is the rise of AI and how it affects data protection. We're going to look into the limitations of recovery and restore with existing solutions. And then in our third part, we're going to really get some from our experts. We're going to get some advice on what we can actually do about it, right? And how we can actually address these challenges that are coming. So with that, I'm going to pass it to John and Steve to introduce themselves. So John, would you please introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Pleasure to be with you today. I'm John Raper, the Chief Information Security Officer with Chevron.
Okay. Thank you, John. Can't hear. I think we might be hearing you a little bit low. We'll pass it to Steve.
Hey, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Steve Stone. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at SentinelOne. My background's in threat intelligence and event response, and I lead those areas as part of what I do at SentinelOne.
All right. Thank you for that. And yeah, it's really great to have you both here. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And I mean, I think let's start obviously with AI. So we have to start with AI, because it's what's obviously a really hot topic, but also when we think about the reality of the situation, so many more entry points, right, to access data now. So many more users are accessing systems that previously maybe were only open to technical users or a small number of applications. Steve, from your perspective, what is the rise of AI adoption actually changing when it comes to data protection? Like, how have things become different over the last few years?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There's so much in the news and the press and industry reporting that it can be really hard to kind of sort through and distill that down. What I would say is, across the last several years of working incidents and events at SentinelOne, there's really three dominant things I would highlight for this audience. The first is let's talk about what is not happening. We are not seeing attackers use AI to do something that we've never seen before. That has not happened. We have, like, if you look at the MITRE attack framework as an example, we aren't adding new elements to that because there's some brand new thing we've never seen before. That just has not occurred. So the second thing is, what are they using it for? And their attackers are using AI for the exact same things that we are on the defender side. They're using it for efficiency, they're using it to drive scale, and they're using it to drive specificity. I think one of the things that is often missed in the discussions about AI can identify hundreds and thousands of ODAs or exploits, as an example. That's never been the attacker bottleneck. We've always faced an uphill battle there on the defender side. What attackers are able to do, as an example with AI, is find the perfect exploit for a specific target. So they're using it to be highly efficient, highly scalable, and highly specific. So that's the second thing. The third thing I would add is at the macro level, if we zoom all the way out and look at the threat landscape, what AI is really changing is the floor versus the ceiling. The ceiling isn't any higher. What we've already kind of seen that. What has really demonstrably risen, though, is the floor. And what we're seeing is AI can provide capabilities to individuals that used to be the exclusive remit of nation state programs. And I would give two examples. The first is language. And I don't mean programming language. I don't mean Python or C plus or any of that. I mean like actual English, Spanish, Mandarin, Farsi. AI is excellent at solving language problems that used to require massive teams of translators that worked for governments. Individuals and small cyber criminal groups just didn't have that capability. Now they do. Attackers can operate in any language that they just could not before. The other example I would give is the ability to solve gaps. If we look at like the cybercrime ecosystem in particular, it used to be true that specific groups had very narrow ways that they could monetize their intrusions. And they were, in essence, channeled and corralled by those. AI has solved a lot of that. It's extended what a single group or individual can do, leveraging intrusion versus just the intrusion itself. So those are the three big things I would say that we are seeing that really are changing across the landscape.
Okay. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And I mean, thinking about it from that perspective, it makes sense. People are leveraging the AI for things like personalized marketing and things like that, where the language part is obviously a great fit there. When you think about attacks, I guess things like social engineering, phishing, things like that are just made extremely easy to amplify across, borders, countries, languages, with basically no effort. And really interesting to think about that concept that I don't normally think about, when we think about the AI associated threats. Um, I guess, John, from your perspective, at the org level, what are the conversations looking like around this? Are people thinking about, is this something that's registering, as like a big change in the security landscape? And I guess, how should those conversations look internally as organizations evaluate this threat?
Yeah, a few points there. I think it really democratized nation state level capabilities for one. That's
Mhm.
now it's put in the hands of a non technical audience who simply needs to understand how to prompt or create a sophisticated prompt. I think holistically it flipped vulnerability management on its head. Probably a month 6 weeks ago, right? We went from scoring prioritization based on the scoring, really focused on what was remote code executable, to now it's what can be chained together and what's truly exploitable from the internet, right? And to Steve's point, identifying vulnerabilities has never been the problem. It's always been that long tail of remediation. And how do you maintain operational stability um, while aggressively patching or updating whatever needs to be done there? And if you look at kind of that flywheel effect of identification, prioritization, remediation, that work just got infinitely harder on the remediation side of the equation. That's going to be a huge challenge for us. Recent examples of BCPDR and how it was impacted, not necessarily through AI, but through other attacks. United Healthcare, Jaguar, Stryker, business continuity really played a key role in each one of those major initiatives. So AI is really the latest, I guess, vehicle of choice that allows for rapid exploitation, lack of human intervention, automation of these things. It's just going to decrease that time frame that we have to respond to it. And if you look at the adage of if it's now on the internet and it's susceptible, assume it's compromised, is kind of the net new reality for vulnerability management. That puts a
Mhm.
whole new emphasis on business continuity and disaster recovery planning. So, how do you maintain that business operational stability while ensuring that you have absolutely no perimeter facing vulnerabilities? That'll be a challenge for the industry holistically.
Mhm. And so it sounds like, John, then with what you're describing, it's like priorities, we're traditionally, at least I think, as somebody that's not focused every day purely on security challenges. um I would think, right, a lot of that would go into prevention. How do we make sure that we're hardened against certain vulnerabilities? Sounds like what you're saying is that's an important focus, but what people need to be focusing on now is assume, your most critical workloads are going to be compromised or going to be taken down or out of commission, and assume that you need to have a plan for recovery. Is that a kind of the shift that you're describing?
Yeah, obviously the proactive, detective, responsive capabilities are really important. But at the end of the day, I think across the industry, we have to get better at planning for failure.
Hmm.
And we have to fully expect our systems will be compromised, will be impacted by these. But then you have to go a little further now. It's not, it doesn't really stop at does my BIA match my criticality? It really boils down to do I understand all the dependencies? Do I have those mapped? If I lost AD or whatever my authentication solutions are, how does that impact my ability to recover and restore? If I lost my workstations, similar to what was what happened in Striker, how does that impact my RTO and RPO objectives? So there's a lot of kind of downstream implications of this, and where we're focused is how do we align business continuity and disaster recovery with incident response at the end of the day, and just make it a separate function of incident response from a preparedness standpoint, creating a plan for failure, understanding roles and role clarity and responsibilities across each one of our sites or each one of our geographical areas, and then testing those plans in the event of a major catastrophic incident.
Mhm. And so it sounds like from the way that you're describing it, it's not just an IT function. Like I think traditionally it might have been thought of as like, can I mechanically, restore this server from this place to this place? It's more kind of thinking holistically about what happens if this entire area of your business, right, has the infrastructure goes out and it's not available. Is there an actual recovery playbook end to end kind of thing?
Yeah, and are they realistic, and have they been tested, more importantly, right? And take those key lessons learned from each one of those tests, because every tabletop exercise I've ever been a part of has always identified gaps. I mean, that's the objective, right? You have to
Mhm.
continuously test those processes and make sure that you're building the lessons learned back into the program.
Absolutely. And I think this brings us to our really second part of the topic, which is about restoration and recovery. And there's this concept, Steve, about the blind restore. And I think that in many cases, right, at least from what we've seen, right, you kind of go to restore data and I would say unfortunately in many cases the first time that an organization actually tries to recover a workload is when it's compromised. Can you walk us through the concept of a blind restore and some of the things that can happen right when you're doing that type of recovery?
Yeah, I think this is a really really important topic. Have a gazillion opinions on this because we encounter this all the time. And I'll kind of start by taking one of your comments and one of John's comments, and combining those. This is typically done in the heat of the moment. The first full restore. We do tabletops. We identify gaps. Absolutely true. It is very rare we run across an organization that has intentionally tested and stress tested their recovery and restoration process live on the wire. It just rarely happens. And I'm not saying that to knock a given organization. I am saying that to say the first time these buttons get pushed typically is in the middle of a ransomware intrusion where things are very intense. The situation is very muddy. One of the things that I think a lot of organizations assume about an incident response is that you know everything. That's not true at all. That's exactly the point is you have to tease out what has occurred in this crisis moment when what an organization wants to do more than anything is just get back to business. That's where the nature wants to pull. So what we end up seeing, as you're referring to, is the blind restore. We'll start sussing out enough of the intrusion to understand some things, or else, to John's point, you've got a BCDR situation, and it's like, we're running out of time. We're going to do this right now. And what is typically done is organizations will just say, my last snapshot or backup is 24 hours old. We're going to recover to that, and then we're going to be back in the game. And the real issue there is that is often where they're going to recover the attacker. The attacker has often been in those environments for days. Let's use a ransomware as an event as an example. We typically, and again, typically these are broad statements, but we typically see a ransomware actor active in an environment for about 5 to 7 days before they deploy ransomware. That is that takes time to understand and suss out. And organizations don't want to lose 5 to 7 days of data. They don't want to go through the process to understand all that. So they end up doing just enough to locate and isolate the intrusion, Then they recover from, let's say, 24 hours, and the attackers are just right back in the environment. We're literally deploying the attacker into an environment. I've seen it hundreds of times. So that's what often occurs. What we say is the right answer is really understanding at a granular level restoration. So again, I'll use that 5 days time frame. That does not mean the attackers have access to every single thing in environment for that entire time. The more you understand where the attacker has been or maintains presence, you can do much more precision recoveries and make much more intentional decisions about how you recover your business. And again, that's not often how playbooks and tabletops are built. It's like hit the button, we recover, great. So that specificity is really, really important. And also being able to verify that the attacker will not maintain presence upon that recovery, which really implies a whole other set of behaviors around how do we verify that? How do we know that that backup is accurate? It's what we want. And again, the attacker doesn't have presence. And then I would say just the very last tension point we often see is, again, this, if we start with the premise that the first really big recovery event is happening during an event response, here's two teams that rarely know each other very well: the backup team and the security team or the incident responders. The number of times that we have actually been in breaches as SentinelOne and had to introduce these teams to each other, like, could fill a room. So we don't often see those teams working hand in hand. So they're making decisions in isolation. And now it's a CISO or CIO problem because that's where it's going to be deconflicted because it was not worked at that lower team level. So we see that this is a real problem. We see it all the time.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think, I mean, John, that kind of makes me think if we think about this concept of a blind restore of, hitting the button for the first time in the heat of the moment, and obviously the risk of bringing back like the exact threat that we're trying to recover from a CISO perspective. Is there like a kind of I don't know if there's metrics or measurements or ways for these like alarm bells to go off that there's a risk of this happening? How can executives kind of take a look and understand how at risk their organization is for this type of situation?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that we report on, but we also try to track. Starting with the fundamentals. Do my BIAs match my RTO and RPO metrics? Most of the time, the business has a definition of what's critical. IT has a definition of what's critical, and sometimes those don't match. That's a reality, especially in large enterprises. So it's very frequent that you'll run across a business impact analysis that may not have a tier 3 classification, but is set up like a tier 3 application to restore and recover. Ironing out who owns that process. Is that right? Is it sufficient? And does the business requirements match the technical policy implementation? That's step one. Understanding what percentage of your backups are truly immutable, how they're segmented and isolated. Are they protected by MFA? Are they encrypted at rest? All these things. Just getting really solid fundamentals. And then to Steve's point around testing, we're trying to do some things around testing a subset of applications because, to his point, it's not typical that you push a big red button and you try to fail over all your applications at one time. But pick a subset based on criticality, restore those, take away the key lessons learned, expand upon that test every year, every quarter, and then continuously refine that process. So when it happens, because it'll happen to all of us at some point, you understand the complexities. If AD goes down, what are the true implications? What are all my dependencies if this tier 1 app goes down that need to be restored first? Who owns those? How do we get in touch with those people? How do we make it as efficient as possible? And do we truly understand the complexity of what we're doing and how things work in reality? That's also a big challenge in a large enterprise environment. Typically, there's always the unknowns. Even from the application owners, they don't truly understand how their applications authenticate or flow. So the worst time to learn those things is in the middle of an incident. But all of those things are things that we report up, and all those things are items that we track. Most importantly, to Steve's point, from a security perspective, we don't typically own backup, restoration, recovery. That's usually an IT infrastructure, cloud engineering type of function. CISOs have to get involved in that process, have to understand it holistically, and have to tabletop it and understand that they have grasp over that area of the business.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that kind of comes up here and you say that is I think that in a lot of cases like this concept of being able to actually go and run tabletop exercises, test the recoverability of applications, things like that. There are things that almost every organization I would say that has significant technology investment, they want to do it, and I would say almost everyone is planning to do it, but there's a certain kind of barrier in being able to find the time and being able to actually invest the engineering effort required and things like that. So one thing that I think that we've seen is being able to provide this is as from the Eon perspective, obviously, being able to make data recovery an actual, let's say, achievable kind of task has really helped a lot of our customers actually implement these types of exercises. Because when you can go and automate, the recovery of resources on a regular basis, or make sure that the actual data that you need to recover is available within backup snapshots, that's become, at least from what we've seen, a more achievable goal and something that customers are more likely to actually go and implement. And a big point that you mentioned there is, there's the actual RTO and RPO goals. And a lot of times without actually restoring data, it's really hard to understand what your RPO is or what your RTO is for a particular resource. And so that's I think a pretty critical area that we see. And I'm wondering, from I guess from both your perspectives, but maybe, Steve, if we think about in the context of I'm going and taking backups, org-wide within an organization, thousands of different servers, thousands of different applications. How do we go and then I guess even get started at the idea of thinking about this recovery problem, right? Where you referred to the idea of understanding that when I go and recover a particular snapshot or a particular point in time of my data set, that I'm not going to be recovering the same attacker back into my production environment.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really critical things there. One is it is really incumbent on organizations to understand how intrusions work because that's going to drive the right decisions. And I don't mean that to be dismissive in any way, shape, or form. I just mean that what people kind of have in their head for how malicious events occur is often not how it executes. So that's the first thing is understand what really happens. Second thing, and I'll just kind of keep stealing things that John has already said, this is about getting the business back online. The number of organizations that have either done security in isolation and business in isolation and not overlap those two, now you're going to have to figure that out. You are going to have to do that action. You're just now going to do it in the heat of the moment when there is as much pressure as there could possibly be, which is the worst time in the world to do this. So I just would kind of really plus one John's comments about understanding that because you're not, I have never, and nevers and always are really dangerous in this business, but I have never seen a full restore. I've never seen it once. It's always partial restores and it's always sequential. It's always like, we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. Do organizations understand that? And can they overlay that with a real genuine understanding of how an intrusion has worked? So I would say that's kind of part one. I think the second part, and I'll kind of dive down one level here. One of the things that I think, if we're all being really honest, has changed in this industry in the last, let's say, decade is backup and recovery. It's become much more important in the era of ransomware. I don't want to make it sound ambulance chasing, but ransomware has been good for the backup and recovery business. It is critical technology that is really being stress tested, live and on the wire. So as we think about that, the point I would make there is the attackers have understood that as well. We talk about ransomware, and what we typically have in our mind is that encryption event. We almost never these days see an encryption only ransomware intrusion. We see the encryption, we see data theft, we see long term access. And so understanding that and the total risk is really important. And just the last point I would leave on that is if we go back, let's just say a decade, it's been about 10 years that we've seen ransomware really shift from targeting individuals to targeting organizations and the big payouts. What we have seen over that time is organizations have been much better about recovering past the encryption event. That this has been a painful lesson across the industry, but there have been really significant improvements. So most organizations are ready to have some form of discussion about recovery. They are probably not prepared for that discussion about data extortion and saying, hey, we've got your data and we will drop it all online. That is, in the last, let's say, 18 months, that is why the vast majority of ransoms have been paid. It is, if you're a hospital, it's not even about recovery for your operations. It's you have an ethical requirement to not let patient data be publicly available. That may, in and of itself, drive organizations to pay a ransom. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I am saying that's a discussion most organizations have not had, even if they've had a discussion around, hey, are we prepared to do recovery? So I think that's the other element, is really understanding what is actually going on and the stress points that an organization will actually go through in these ransomware intrusions.
Mhm. I think that that's really, really great point, Steve. And talking about, areas that are kind of blind spots, really, really important to think about. And I think one of the things as we move into, final part of our discussion where we're going to be looking at, what we have to actually do about, right, these blind spots that exist. One thing that kind of like to highlight that I think we've been thinking a lot about at Eon is this concept of not just having a recovery strategy or a backup and recovery strategy where you're basically doing a kind of set it and forget it on snapshotting. So we take the approach where obviously we work across all the cloud hyperscalers and support databases, servers, things like that. And as customers are going and connecting up their environments and protecting them with Dion, it's not like just ingesting the data, doing the deduplication, backing up the data source like you would traditionally think about. It's essentially every single time a backup is being taken, understanding what's changed since the previous one. So we think about that the same way for, like block storage as we do for databases, whether they're like managed databases or not. So what that means is, and I think you brought this point up before, Steve, you talk about this idea of, an attacker can be in an environment for a week, right? 5 to 7 days, let's say, before a ransomware event actually occurs. Do you have any mechanism for being able to actually detect that? Right. So obviously, you can have detection running maybe on some critical workloads, but do you have an actual overview or what we call, right, an active kind of posture solution where all of the data sets that you have that are being backed up, you can run comparisons on them on a day by day basis and identify, has there been a mass deletion of database rows? Has there been certain data that has been, encrypted or scrambled in some way, right, within your kind of landscape? So I think that's something that's really important in the way that we think about it, where it's saying not just, kind of like naively running a backup and then assuming that all the snapshots are clean, but understanding with each backup that's being run, does it contain malware? Has some data changed, et cetera? And I'd love to ask, John, from your perspective, is there a kind of, I guess, like mechanisms or things like that you've seen teams use where they have that concept dialed in, right? Having like an active recovery posture. What does the difference look like between a team that is aware and has alarm bells go off when the integrity of their data changes on a daily basis versus ones where that'll just remain latent until things blow up?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, preparation is probably the most important phase of incident response, in my opinion. It's truly understanding what you own, how it's backed up, how it's monitored, what frequencies, what level of data loss is acceptable. Right, all those questions have to be answered, and yeah, some key learnings there really boiled down to, it takes time, honestly, to conduct an investigation. If you bring Steve and tell you a minute, it takes them a little while, right, to understand root cause. How did the attackers get in? What did they touch? But typically, you don't have that luxury of conducting the full investigation and then keeping the business on hold. So you have to do them in parallel. So obviously, the more automated, the more technical enforced policy controls you can implement, the better telemetry you have visibility into, the more effective that restoration recovery, but also the containment and eradication phase of incident response will be. Ideally, you want that to run incredibly soon, but that all goes back to really focusing on preparation, making sure that you have adequate logging, visibility, RTO, RPO, what goes down, and have a plan to recover it. It also goes into things that you don't normally think about from an IR perspective, but from a business continuity perspective, things I would be asking my team: what happens if we lose a cloud region? What happens? What's the impact if this SaaS provider goes down or this hyperscaler goes down? Right, all these aggregated points of failure that we have across the industry, we truly need to understand from an organization by organization perspective how that impacts us, and then have a plan to mitigate that risk.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering if we take this kind of back to where we were looking at the start, where I mean I think that both with you John and Steve, you guys mentioned the concept of AI as a let's say as an accelerator of attacks, or from looking at the side of bad actors there. When we think about how AI is democratizing access to data, democratizing, management of infrastructure. So it's not really, it's also non-technical users that are accessing more and more critical data sets and organizations because, they have agentic workflows that are developed on top of them, et cetera, chatbots, customer service workflows, but also people that are managing infrastructure. I think, for in many organizations, and some of the largest organizations in the world, they have actual, cloud and data center IT where DevOps engineers are using Claude Code, Cursor, things like that to run actual infrastructure management. And so I'm wondering, what is, your philosophy, Steve, or your view on this, where it seems like, right, there's potential there maybe for things like prompt injection or other kinds of more sophisticated attacks that can kind of enter in at the point where operators are now managing IT environments using AI workflows. So, Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot there. What I would say with is, I think one is that there's a lot of value in that work being done, but it comes with new risk surface area. And that, if there's one lesson we have learned in the security industry with every single technology, is we often think about that risk surface area far later than we do the initial implications or initial implementations, I should say. So that's a thing we should think through. The second thing I would say is I think AI in particular, if we look at the whole spectrum of that, let's just go automation all the way through frontier AI. I think this is one of those rare opportunities where I genuinely believe that the technology is better suited to solve long-term defender problems than it is attacker problems. So the use cases you just mentioned there, like AI is really great at solving a bunch of that. It's really great at saying, let's understand a huge amount of data, let's understand workflows, let's implement procedures. And ultimately, if we compare AI with automation, that's a real home run. And I'll go back to the playbooks that we've all kind of mentioned several times. It's one thing to have a playbook, it's another thing to automate a bunch of that. So now you're not doing it live when you really, really need to. And you can test automation, you can verify it, and you can tie it into, using AI as a visibility engine, but also as an action engine if you do these other things. And I think there's really profound benefits when that is done right. The thing I would really caveat, though, is one of the things that we see, and we've already kind of mentioned it two or three times on this call, is there can be an isolation between the different teams involved in solving these problems. AI can really make some of those silos of excellence even tighter in some ways. So we've got to find ways that there are institutional uses of AI or broad scale access to an AI tool. One of the things that we do see in the early adoption of AI on the defender and the operator side of the house is, like, a person tends to have a really great AI tool for their workflow. That's awesome. That's totally different from an institutional answer where everyone has that capability or the organization itself does. So I would really give that as a cautionary tale and also just a real opportunity. AI can really genuinely solve problems that we have really deeply struggled with for decades.
Mhm. Absolutely. And it's just funny when you describe it that way, and this is one area that I think would be really interesting when you put it in the sense of AI is kind of enabling the defender in ways that, intuitively you might not realize it, but the kind of patterns that we just described, right? Where DevOps engineers are going in there and using things like Claude Code or Codex or whatever kind of AI assistant workflow, you might be able to do things that previously, like implementing observability, implementing certain monitoring workflows, implementing, automated recovery workflows that previously would have taken weeks or months of engineering work or working with different teams. And you can kind of spec them out and implement them in ways that might have previously been impossible. So I think that for sure there's all of that in there. And I think like what you're saying is understanding that you still need to have the right guardrails in place and understand that the blast radius of what you're doing when you're implementing, infrastructure changes with AI is a little bit greater than if you're just using it for kind of personal productivity projects.
Yeah, and Leo, let me give you just one example. I've seen this at multiple organizations we've worked with. I think it's just such a good example of what you just described. We've all tried to tackle the impossible traveler scenario. You know, attackers love valid credentials, and now you've got a user in India and you've got a user in China. Well, it's impossible to be in both places at once. That has typically been a very, very manual process. Our own SOC here at SentinelOne, one of the ways that they use an AI module is they actually just integrate that with our travel system, they integrate it with our PTO and leave system, and they integrate it with our security systems. So now we don't have to go and do that manual tracking down. We can actually just say, like, the machines can level up, like, hey, this is a suspicious login. Also, this person is actually traveling there because we can see it in the travel system. Or conversely, we know this person is somewhere else. Those are not new problems, but the we have now taken that from a manual problem to like actually leveraging all of our available data. We rarely talk about travel systems as a security tool, but it is now. AI allows us to really do that.
Mhm. Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And I think the only area I'd kind of add it when we think about using AI as a tool to also be a force multiplier on the defender side as opposed to the attacker side. I think there's a lot of areas to look at it. And just one additional one I would say is if you think about something. This is a way that we've kind of implemented that type of approach is being able to achieve things like data classification, app classification at scale, right? So being able to understand based on when an organization is going and starting to implement their backup and recovery strategy, as those resources are going and being ingested into if it's Eon or any backup solution, you want to be able to understand, right, what is actually running on those machines. And so a critical part of the way that we've kind of approached this is being able to understand if, for example, whether it's a particular machine is running an unauthorized coding assistant or AI model server like VLLM or Llama CPP or something like that, or even just detecting running versions of databases, web servers, et cetera. And so being able to combine, that metadata of what is running on a particular machine, and compare that with what should be running on a particular machine can be really, really valuable from organizations. And so I think that exactly like you're describing, when you take all these capabilities that we have now to do inference, and then you kind of give organizations a platform where they can actually understand what's going on with their data and how it's changing on a daily basis. There's all kinds of opportunities for having a much more proactive kind of posture set up instead of just kind of saying, I'm relying on, waiting for an incident to happen and then assuming that, and then blindly kind of going back into my backups in order to recover. So really, really cool. And I think based on your point and what we've been seeing, there's a lot of options out there for teams to actually implement this now. where in ways that weren't really so easy to do just 1 or 2 years ago. And so that being said, I would ask you, John, again, as a if we're talking to any CISOs here, what should they be asking, their backup or their resiliency teams to look at this quarter? Like what do you think is the kind of concrete asks or things that they should be looking at in the near term, given all the challenges that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think it's a big focus on the fundamentals again. When was our last backup, restoration, recovery? Have we validated that our process is sufficient in terms of restoring from a clean backup? Those are always important. Do our BAs align with our backup procedures, from a tier criticality ranking perspective? Do we have clear roles and responsibilities if we lose a critical app? If we lose a critical dependency, right? Have we tested that? Do we have basic things like communications in place if we lost corporate comms across the company? If we lost our workstations, what's our plan? Right? I mean, you start thinking about the things that could go wrong, right? You lost AD, you lost physical access. These have also been a part of, most recent notable breaches across the industry. Losing AD is always a target, right? So just work down that dependency tree, take those into account, plan for those to fail, and then build your processes from the ground up. And then constantly challenge your teams from a KPI perspective of how are we progressing and how are we maturing the capabilities. And ideally, to your point, every step along that way is a chance for automation and a technical enforcement of policy. Work your way towards that.
Absolutely. And Steve, from your perspective, I think you have a very kind of wide view into trends that are going around here. What do you think is the conversation is heading in terms of recovery when it comes to cloud infrastructure over the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I think it's going to really drive in a couple of different ways. I think the first, when we talk about recovery and cloud and kind of all things in that topic, one thing is that AI is going to expand all that demonstrably and rapidly. If we think about what AI is, it's essentially only three things. It's a model, it's an identity we assign to that model, and it's access to data. And the more data you put in front of it, the better it is. Well, that's going to be a lot more data. What we typically don't see is that people are running AI models, especially for the first time, on top of production data. So they're creating a whole other set. And now that is now risk surface area. So I think that's the first big change. Is I think as tough as this challenge is today, I think it's going to be much tougher in the next 12 to 18 months, specifically because of what AI requires. So I think that's change number one. Change number two, as I think, is this is going to come down to speed and decision making at lower levels. One of the things that is undeniable about where we are going, and again, this is largely driven by AI, is the speed of attacks is going up demonstrably, which means the speed of decision making is going on our end as the defenders is going to have to go up demonstrably. And so what used to be kind of a baked in ability to bring in decision makers was the manual time it took to understand something on both sides, attacker and defender. That is crushing down on both sides of that equation. And so this decision making process we're used to having where a line level analyst sees a thing and talks to their manager, and that makes its way up probably to the CISO. And then we're having these discussions. Like, I think in 18 months, that's not how most of this is going to work. We're going to have to make very intentional decisions about what do we let that junior SOC analyst working on a Sunday night decide, and they can make rapid implementations because of AI and integration with existing technologies. So I think that's going to be something that we're going to be talking about very differently in 18 months from now.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really great point, and with how fast things are changing, really interesting to think about what things are going to look like in a pretty short time. And with that, first of all, I want to say this has been really interesting discussion. I think that we've kind of answered a number of pretty critical topics here. I'd like to bring up a couple of questions that we had come up from the Q&A. So The first one is if we think about the idea of immutability, and this is going to be, I think, a good one for John. You know, how critical do you think the aspect is of both immutability and air gapping when it comes to backups or having your actual backup data outside of the blast radius of whatever the source workload is? Do you see that as critical? Are there situations where immutability doesn't matter for backup data?
Yeah, I think they're both very critical, especially Steve. I'd welcome your opinion on this as well. With the advanced AI models and the attacks and being able to chain together low level issues and then exploit something, I think air gap buys you quite a bit. And in the OT space, anyway, Cisco's coming out with something called CI Fortify, which is in effect be able to run in an isolated mode, absent of any third party dependencies or even the internet for some period of time, right? And I think that speaks to the need to further, especially where you have critical infrastructure, run in that isolated environment. So anything from an air gap immutability perspective to me is very, very important and is probably worth the time and investment to get there. But Steve, I'm curious to get your perspective.
Yeah, I would completely agree on all of that for every single reason you said. I think it's important for control. I think it's important for defense. The other element I would throw out, and we're gonna range kind of far here away from like an intrusion, but I think things like immutability, where that data is hosted, and air gaps specifically, those are now geopolitical topics. And I'll give one example here at SentinelOne. We've primarily been a cloud-based technology. We've always had kind of on-prem instances, but those were secondary. The world is changing around us. They're just legislation, different things. The ability to talk about self-hosted, sovereign cloud, and really being able to definitively prove to governments your data is where you say it is and it's controlled in the way you say it is. These are now things that are going in contracts. These are now things that are mission critical. These are not nice to haves. And it's almost like the balkanization of the internet in some ways. And so the ability to say, my data is here, I can clearly control who has access to it, I can control how it is accessed. These are now as much compliance and geopolitical regulatory topics as they are defense topics. And I don't see that changing at all. And that's definitely accelerated by AI, but that is not new because of AI. So I think we are really going to lean far more heavily on these things moving forward.
That's a great point, Stephen. And I guess as a follow-up to that, one interesting maybe twist there is how do you think that trend kind of applies for SaaS heavy organizations, right? Where most of their critical data is sitting in third-party providers where they don't necessarily own the backup or have control over the backup.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem for a couple of reasons. One is what you can't see and control, you now don't own decision making on it. And I'll keep coming back to that decision making term because I think that's what businesses do. That's what C suites understand risk. They understand decision making. That's what they're designed to do. When you don't have those levers, you are completely at the whim of other organizations, and that has some real cons to it for very obvious reasons. The other thing I would say on that, and I think this is one of those areas, man, we see this stress tested during intrusions all the time. We hear organizations say, "Hey, we're cloud or we're on prem." I'm not sure I've ever seen a genuinely on-prem or cloud or SaaS environment. It's all hybrid. Every organization has some element of those three things, usually. They almost always have at least two of the three. So the ability to control and impact your data that you require to run on, people should really pay attention to where that resides and their ability to impact it. I'll just kind of keep stealing stuff that John said earlier. He mentioned some of those business systems and business apps. I'll tell you that the number of times we do a lot of proactive services within SentinelOne. We do the tabletops. We walk organizations through. Here's what we should think through. One of the very first questions we ask is, give us your business critical systems and how long you can live with that being degraded. The number of times I do not see Salesforce on there. And then we ask, like, okay, if you can't transact for 24 hours, what happens to your business? And they say, we're absolutely done. That's a non-starter. We must. And it's like, well, we got to talk about Salesforce then. That's a problem. And I think it just kind of comes back to that entire SaaS world, and it's about data. Like, it's about, can you control and influence and impact your data, and can you understand it? And if you don't have visibility into one of those three elements of a hybrid environment, like, that's a lot of risk that organizations accept, and often accept it unintentionally.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll
Oh,
add
yeah,
to
John.
those. Well, I think it's important from a CISO perspective to reach out to each one of those SaaS providers. There's a shared security model where so many of those things are configurable. Now, it may drive an increase in contract pricing, wholeheartedly. We need to go in and understand the fundamentals of this. Should that SaaS app be internet facing? Should it be restricted to my corporate IP space? Are we receiving logs? Is it SSO integrated, MFA, whatever the case may be? Can I designate a backup and restoration point? Now, all that will drive costs, but it's imperative for us to know the reality of where it sits today and what options we do have. So I'd encourage everyone to go look at each one of their major SaaS providers and have that conversation.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's a great point. I think like both of you highlighted, it's this idea that if you have a backup of any type of resource, but especially a SaaS product, if the backup is living along with the SaaS application, and sometimes it's kind of you're losing from on that air gap, or at least logical air gap kind of concept of your backups for sure. Um, I want to say, guys, that's all we have. I think all the time we have for questions. But just to kind of summarize, I think we had really interesting and pretty wide-ranging conversation here. Especially when we think about, I think takeaway from it for me was the idea of how AI is impacting not just, and I think this is what my takeaway when we were coming in here. I was thinking more from the perspective of how it's enabling attackers to accelerate. But I think we also looked at the concept of how it's also creating, additional challenges because of democratizing access to critical data. And then also enabling defenders, right, to increase the ways that we're actually preventing and improving our response. We also talked about, right, different challenges, and actually making sure that we're not doing blind recoveries. We're doing tabletop exercises and actually making sure that we can recover. So really interesting and wide range of topics. I really appreciate Steve and John, you guys joining. And thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. So yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thanks
yeah.
for having us.
See you guys. Bye bye.